She was the kind of woman the world walked past. For 3 years, she arrived before sunrise, brewed the coffee, scheduled the surgeries, corrected the mistakes without ever being called by her name. To them, she was just the secretary. But what happens when the woman no one sees decides? She's done being invisible. Rachel Whitman never wanted power. She wanted purpose. But a quiet act of defiance, one glass of water, spilled at the right moment, would unravel secrets, shake boardrooms, and force a man too proud to listen, to finally hear. What made her risk it all in a room full of people who barely knew she existed? Why would a millionaire surgeon, cold, brilliant, untouchable, begin to question everything because of her? And how did a woman who once walked the halls in silence end up building a home for voices like hers? This is not a story about revenge, it's a story about truth, and the courage it takes to speak it out loud. If this story touches something in you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Shining Stories. Now, let's begin. Every morning at 5:37 a.m., long before the hospital stirred, Rachel Whitman walked in through the side door. No one noticed, and for a long time, that's exactly how she wanted it. Outside, the Colorado sky was still ink dark, the mountains not yet outlined by dawn. The air bit at her cheeks as she locked her car and walked briskly across the staff lot, her heels clicking on the pavement with a rhythm only she could hear. She pulled her coat tighter, her fingers already familiar with the cold metal of the employee entrance keypad. Inside, the quiet wrapped around her like a worn, familiar coat. Fluorescent lights flickered to life in the break room as she flipped a single switch, enough to illuminate the space but not enough to shatter the silence. Rachel placed her bag down in its usual spot under her desk and moved toward the coffee station. She didn't drink coffee. She preferred Earl Grey with honey, but she made 2 pots anyway. One regular, one decaf. She always did. It was a small courtesy to the staff who would arrive later, and to Dr. Nathan Collier, who liked his coffee black and hot by 6:00 sharp. She never had to be asked. She just knew. She straightened the chairs in the small conference room, wiped down the table with the last napkin from her lunch yesterday, and laid out the day's folders in neat, color-coded stacks. The printer was still humming from the late-night auto jobs. She retrieved the final set of operating room assignments and placed them carefully in a file marked Collier, AM. By 5:47, everything was in place. Everything always was. No one else had arrived yet. Rachel sat at her desk, her back straight, her hands folded neatly on her lap. A few strands of auburn hair slipped from behind her ear, and she tucked them back without thought. Her desk calendar was pristine, updated down to the hour. Digital reminders beeped quietly on her screen. Her computer loaded slowly, not because it was old, but because the hospital network was always sluggish before sunrise. She glanced down at her shoes, navy blue flats, the same pair she had worn every Monday for almost a year. The left one had a small crease near the toe, a sign of use, dependability. That's how people saw her: dependable, quiet, there, not Rachel, just her, the admin girl, the calendar lady. She had even heard a surgical tech once refer to her as the woman who makes the day not fall apart. It wasn't meant unkindly, but it wasn't personal either. There was a time Rachel cared, a time she waited for someone to say her name with recognition. But over time, the absence of acknowledgement had become its own kind of armor, a protective hush. Dr. Nathan Collier, her boss, had passed her desk hundreds of times in 3 years, rarely with a word. He was a man of excellence and exactness, a brilliant neurosurgeon, and also one of the hospital's largest private investors, tall, crisp, intimidating in a way that was neither cruel nor warm, just distant. He never raised his voice. He didn't need to. He barely looked anyone in the eye. Rachel didn't expect kindness from him. What she wanted, if she dared to name it, was to be seen. Just once. Not as the person who filled in for everyone else, but as someone with her own name, her own mind, her own quiet dignity, A cold draft slipped under the office door and brushed against her ankles. She rubbed her hands together and leaned toward the space heater under her desk. Its hum was soft, familiar. Everything was familiar. Every morning followed the same script, a quiet ballet of preparation before the chaos began. And Rachel. She moved through it like clockwork, without ripple, without pause. The window across from her desk began to pale slightly, the first suggestion of morning. Frost spidered along the bottom corner of the glass. Outside, the pine trees stood solemn and tall, like sentinels watching over the waking town. She loved this moment, this hush before the storm of charts, beeping machines, and clipped hallway conversations. But some mornings, like today, the silence pressed heavier than usual. Her computer chimed a soft, hollow sound as the inbox loaded. She scanned the new messages, one from facilities about the broken copier, another from admin reminding staff about the Thanksgiving potluck sign-up. She hadn't added her name. She probably wouldn't. And there, second from the top, was the folder she had marked last night. Legal Review, European Partnership. It wasn't her department, but a mistake had jumped out at her. A misaligned code in the surgical supply chain that could raise red flags with international donors. She had flagged it, printed a hard copy, slipped it onto Dr. Collier's desk, even though she knew he might never look at it. She didn't expect acknowledgement. She rarely got it. By 5:59, she stood and poured his coffee. Strong, black, no sugar, no lid. She placed it on his desk on a coaster, as always. Then she returned to her seat. At 6:02, she heard his footsteps. They were even, sharp, confident. He passed her desk without a glance. His office door clicked shut behind him. The sun finally pushed through the edge of the horizon, casting a soft gold across the tiled hallway. Rachel turned slightly in her chair, watching the light crawl toward her feet. Her reflection in the window was faint, barely there. Today would be the same, like always, but somewhere inside her, something barely perceptible stirred, like the shift of a breeze behind a closed door, or the whisper of a thought not yet formed. It was too quiet to name, too fragile to grasp, and yet it was there. Before she was Rachel the secretary, she was Rachel the dreamer. But dreams don't pay the rent, and grief doesn't come with a handbook. There was a time long before coffee pots and clipped hallway greetings when Rachel Whitman moved through the world like it belonged to her. She had been 25, bold and quick-tongued, studying health systems administration with a full scholarship and a notepad filled with plans. She had color-coded spreadsheets mapping rural healthcare deserts across Colorado, and a whiteboard in her tiny apartment where she scribbled solutions for patient access and policy reform. Her professors loved her. Her classmates envied her discipline. But the only voice she truly listened to was Eric's. Eric Whitman was warmth in a hoodie, the kind of man who believed in fixing everything with his hands, cars, fences, hearts. He wasn't an academic, but he understood Rachel better than any textbook ever could. He listened to her talk for hours about the brokenness of the system, and then, almost casually, he said, "Let's build our own." They were 27 and fearless, dreaming up a free community health center in Buena Vista, the town where Eric's parents had lived, and where Rachel first volunteered at a food bank during her undergrad. They planned to name it Willa House, even before Willow was born, a center that offered walk-in clinics, education workshops for new mothers, grief counseling for veterans, warm meals served with dignity, not pity, a space for healing in the places most forgotten. Their apartment back then had been small, but it held dreams in every corner. The kitchen wall was covered in post-its of ideas, patient flow diagrams, and budget drafts scrawled in Eric's uneven handwriting. Rachel still remembered how his eyes lit up when they talked about opening day. No marble floors, he joked, but the doors always open. She had laughed and written it down as their motto. Then came the winter Willa turned 2. It had snowed steadily for 2 days, blanketing the mountains with a deceptive kind of peace. Eric had gone out early to pick up supplies from a hardware store for their remodeling project. Rachel remembered making pancakes in the kitchen, humming to the radio, while Willa toddled around with a wooden spoon. The phone call came just after 10 Willa. They said it was quick, that he likely didn't feel anything. A sheet of black ice on Highway 285, no other vehicles involved. Rachel stood in the kitchen for what felt like hours after hanging up. The pan on the stove blackened and smoked. Willa began to cry. Something inside her began to unravel and never quite stitched itself back together. The funeral was a blur. People she barely knew brought casseroles and condolences. Her professors offered extensions she never used. The whiteboard was wiped clean the day after the burial. Rachel packed the folders into a cardboard box and labeled it later. She dropped out of the graduate program the next week, citing personal circumstances. The scholarship was quietly reallocated. She moved back to a small rental near her mother in Grand County, where she could at least count on a babysitter and a stocked fridge. The dream didn't die in one moment. It faded, like ink left too long in the sun. Finding the job at Grand Summit Health had been a decision rooted in necessity. Benefits, reliable hours, and a place where she could be useful without being asked to speak too much. The kind of job where no one questioned the bags under her eyes, or why she didn't join Friday lunches. She didn't have to be inspiring anymore. She only had to be efficient. Years passed like breath in winter. Visible for a moment, then gone. Rachel built a routine morning commutes with lukewarm tea, lunch breaks in the staff lounge, scrolling through photos of Willa, evenings with laundry and lesson planning and bath time stories. It was a life she kept afloat with quiet tenacity, a life that didn't allow space for what could have been. But the ache never really left. It clung to certain corners of her world, the ceramic teapot Eric had found at a thrift store on their first anniversary, now slightly chipped but still in use, the bookshelf he built from salvaged wood, standing unevenly in her living room, and the manila folder she hadn't touched in 5 years sitting beneath her bed, covered in dust and a kind of sacred stillness. That folder held everything: her original graduate school acceptance letter, Eric's hand-drawn clinic sketches, photos of the lot they had planned to buy, even the napkin with their mission statement written in pencil. Some nights, after Willa had gone to sleep, Rachel would sit on the worn blue couch in the living room and stare at that bookshelf. The walls around her were filled with warm light lamplight, not hope, the kind that glowed but didn't reach too far. She had told herself for so long that this was enough, that surviving was a kind of victory, that sacrifice was the cost of motherhood. But something had shifted lately. It began as a restlessness barely noticeable, a question that lingered longer than usual when she brewed her tea, or folded Willa's laundry, or watched the sun rise through the hospital's frosted windows. It was a voice not loud, not demanding, but insistent in its quiet. Is this all there is? That afternoon, after returning from the hospital and settling Willa with a drawing pad and her favorite cartoon, Rachel walked into her bedroom. She sat on the edge of the bed, slowly lowered herself to her knees, and reached under the frame. Her fingers found the familiar edges of the box. The cardboard had softened over time, corners bent from being moved but never opened. She set it on the bed, wiped the dust with the sleeve of her sweater, and exhaled slowly. Inside was the folder. Willa House, Draft 1, scrawled across the front in Eric's handwriting. Her hands trembled as she opened it, not because she didn't know what was inside, but because she did. The letter was on top her acceptance into the Master of Health Administration program, dated 5 years and 2 weeks ago. She read it slowly, as if it had been written to someone else, someone who still had both hands on the wheel, someone who had not been left behind in the snow. She found a copy of their budget outline, printed in blue ink with red notes from Eric. Below that, a small envelope containing a photo of the empty building they had wanted to lease. The image had yellowed slightly. She remembered taking it on a walk together, him holding Willa, her holding the camera. She sat with it all for a long time, the minutes stretching without shape. The house was quiet, save for the soft hum of the old radiator in the hallway. The past did not flood her. It seeped in, like warm water over tired feet, gentle, relentless. She didn't cry. Not this time. She simply sat there, the weight of memory not crushing, but anchoring her. Outside, the wind picked up slightly, brushing against the windows with a dry, whispering hand. A car passed on the street, its headlights carving slow lines across the wall. Rachel gathered the papers and placed them back into the folder carefully, but not as reverently as before. She didn't tuck it back under the bed. Instead, she stood, walked to the bookshelf Eric had built, and set the folder down on the second shelf between a collection of poetry and Willa's baby book. It didn't feel like a declaration. Not yet. But it felt like something. 5 years later, she had never gone back to that folder until now. Something, somehow, was beginning to stir. For 3 years, she scheduled his surgeries, corrected his typos, covered his mistakes, and still, he never called her by her name. It wasn't personal. At least, that's what everyone said. In the sterile world of Grand Summit Health's executive wing, silence had its own rhythm. Footsteps meant power. Eye contact meant status. And Rachel Whitman, despite being the heartbeat of the schedule, the gatekeeper of the chief neurosurgeon's day, moved like a ghost in that space, efficient, invisible, essential yet unacknowledged. Dr. Nathan Collier was a man of gravity. He didn't shout, he didn't fumble. He simply was, as if the walls of the hospital had been built around him. His office bore no personal photos, no memorabilia, only journals, models of cranial structure, and meticulously labeled binders that Rachel had alphabetized in her first month on the job. He arrived at 6:02 a.m. and left at 8:16 p.m. on the dot. He drank exactly 3 cups of coffee daily, no sugar, no cream, and not once had he called her Rachel. Sometimes he said you, sometimes her. Once, early on, he had gestured vaguely in her direction during a meeting and said, "My assistant will handle that." That was the closest she had come to having a name in his world. Still, Rachel did her job with unwavering precision. She cross-checked his surgical rosters, pre-filled patient intake summaries, and even adjusted the margin settings on his presentations to match branding protocol. He never asked for that, of course, but he never asked for anything twice either, and that, in this environment, was the unspoken standard of excellence. She had developed a quiet rhythm with his demands, not spoken, but sensed. She could predict the questions he wouldn't voice and the changes he would want before he noticed the error. Her inbox was color-coded, flagged, and tagged. Her physical desktop bore no clutter, even her tea chamomile in the afternoon. Earl Grey in the morning was poured only once her keyboard was free of crumbs and her documents in order. And still, he didn't know her name. The others noticed, of course. They did. Nurses whispered near the copy machine, exchanging glances when Rachel passed. The younger interns sometimes called her calendar girl, not cruelly, just lazily. But the administrative staff, especially those who had been there longer, regarded her with a kind of sympathetic distance, like watching someone iron a shirt while the house burns behind them. "He's a genius," one nurse had told Rachel once, lowering her voice as they waited for the elevator. But cold. Just cold. "You must be made of steel to last this long." Rachel had offered a thin smile. She didn't feel made of steel, more like polished glass, clear, precise, and easily shattered. The air in the executive corridor was always cold, the overhead fluorescents humming faintly as if in constant disapproval. The copier near her desk made a low mechanical cough every 20 seconds. It jammed often, no one ever fixed it. Rachel knew exactly where to press to unstick the tray. She had done it 183 times since January. She kept a log. On that particular Tuesday, the corridor felt unusually tense. There had been murmurs about an upcoming international research partnership, a significant collaboration between Grand Summit and a European private health consortium. The documents had been circulating among the upper administration all week: legal briefs, export compliance data, contract clauses thick with jargon. Rachel wasn't officially part of that process, but she had seen something. It had been late the previous night. She was the only one left in the office, reviewing calendar blocks when a misrouted email arrived attached to it, a financial summary related to the partnership. She wasn't supposed to open it, but the file name matched one she'd been asked to prepare for the monthly board meeting. Out of habit, she clicked. What she saw made her sit up straighter. A line item buried deep in the third page indicated a misclassification of equipment use that could violate export control laws. It was a small error, almost unnoticeable. But if the equipment was intended for restricted use and shipped to the wrong facility under the wrong code, it could bring regulatory scrutiny and worse, legal action. Rachel's first instinct wasn't fear, it was clarity. She printed the page, circled the line in red ink, and highlighted the relevant terms. She pulled the legal guidelines from the hospital's shared drive, found the statute, printed that too. Then, carefully, she assembled it all in a slim file folder. On the front, she wrote in bold capital letters, "Urgent, legal implications." She placed one copy on her own desk and another carefully on Dr. Collier's. But when morning came, the folder sat undisturbed. At 6:02 a.m., as always, he entered without greeting. At 6:05, he began reviewing surgical scans on his screen. At 6:15, he walked past Rachel's desk with a file in hand, heading toward the consultation room. The folder hers remained where she had placed it, unopened. At 8:10 a.m., Rachel sent a follow-up email. The subject line was clear, the body short, professional, and direct. She attached the same files with annotations. She marked it high importance and flagged it. By 8:45 a.m., her inbox showed unread. By 9:30, it still showed unread. And still, no one had said her name. During the morning break, Rachel sat quietly in the staff lounge. Her tea grew cold as voices floated around her. Discussions about weekend plans, a staff member's new car, someone gossiping softly about Collier's ego and how he had apparently shot down a VP's idea mid-meeting yesterday. She didn't join the conversation. She never did. Instead, she stared at the faint coffee stain on the table shaped like a ring, just slightly overlapping with another older one. Even the tables had layers of what people left behind. Back at her desk, the noise of the hospital rose, steadily beeping monitors, intercom announcements, the steady clack of shoes on tile. Rachel answered calls, redirected vendors, confirmed appointments, and updated calendars. She moved with practiced ease, her fingers barely pausing between tasks. But inside her, something frayed a little. She thought of that folder under her bed. She thought of Eric. She thought of Willa and the drawings she taped to the fridge each week. She thought of the folder on Dr. Collier's desk, still untouched. By noon, the executive team met behind closed doors. Rachel remained outside, typing minutes for a different meeting, monitoring 3 inboxes and tracking room reservations. Dr. Collier passed her twice. The second time, he glanced at her briefly but said nothing. She wondered if he even noticed the folder on his desk, or the red ink, or the subject line in his inbox. Maybe he didn't see it. Maybe he didn't see her. As the day crept toward evening, Rachel packed up slowly. Her shift technically ended at 4:30, but she often stayed later. Today, she didn't. Before leaving, she walked back into Dr. Collier's office. The folder was still there, exactly where she had placed it. The corner slightly curled now. The email, when she checked one last time on her phone, still said, unread. She didn't sigh. She didn't roll her eyes or mutter in frustration. She simply stood for a moment, her hand resting on the edge of his desk. It wasn't anger she felt, not even disappointment. It was the weight of recognition that she had done everything she could, and still, it might not matter. Still, she had to try. She turned off the desk lamp, closed the office door gently behind her, and walked down the hallway toward the staff exit. Behind her, the fluorescent lights buzzed quietly, and in the stillness of Dr. Collier's office, the tiny notification light on his screen blinked blue, unread. and waiting. There are days when the silence around you feels heavier than any insult. That day, it nearly crushed her. The executive boardroom on the 9th floor was always too cold, not from the air conditioning alone, but from the polished glass walls, the sterile lighting, the silence that lived in corners. Even when filled with people, the room felt like a vacuum, pressurized, orderly, hollow. Rachel sat at the far end of the table, her chair slightly back, as she always did. She wasn't officially a board member. She was there to take minutes, pass handouts, ensure the projector didn't stutter. Her presence wasn't acknowledged, not in name, not in eye contact, not in space. To the others, she was the fixture by the door, the one who kept things moving, the one who didn't speak. The morning light reflected off the conference table in a pale gleam. Everything around her buzzed faintly, pens scribbling, laptops tapping, fingers drumming in impatience. The meeting had been announced as a strategic unveiling, the beginning of a partnership between Grand Summit and a European medical fund to perform cross-continental humanitarian neurosurgeries. Rachel had skimmed the draft proposal the night before. She had seen the inconsistency, the outdated data set, the risk of legal misrepresentation. She had flagged it, highlighted it, sent it. The email remained unread. Now, Dr. Collier stood at the front of the room, sleeves buttoned, tie unmoved, voice even. His tone, as always, was calm but commanding. Around him, the board members nodded, eyes fixed on the slides behind him, charts, projections, patient outreach estimates. Rachel watched the numbers flicker across the screen. Numbers she knew were wrong. Her breath caught as the slide advanced. There it was, the export projection for medical instruments, the code, the error, still there. A knot formed in her chest, not sudden, but tightening, like thread pulled steadily through thick cloth. She looked down at her lap, at her notebook open to a fresh page. Her pen rested gently across the spiral binding. She had two choices, the same two she always had. Say nothing and let it pass. It wasn't her job. Technically, no one had asked her to review legal compliance. No one would blame her or speak up. The room was quiet except for Nathan's voice and the soft swish of screens changing slides. Her name hadn't been mentioned. It never was. But this time, what she saw wasn't a typo or a missed meeting. It was a mistake with consequences. Consequences with names, with faces. Her heart thudded once, then again, harder. She looked around the room. Everyone was focused forward. No one noticed her. Of course they didn't. She had trained them not to. For 3 years, she had nodded, complied, softened her voice. She had made herself small enough to fit between expectations. And now, here she was, holding the weight of a decision in hands that had once only passed coffee. Her palms were damp, her mouth dry. The silence grew louder, not in the room, but inside her. A roaring hush that made her ears ring. It was the sound of years of dismissal, of effort unrecognized, of names unspoken. She remembered Willa's drawing from the night before Mommy at work. It showed a tiny stick figure at a desk. No one else in the picture. That image pressed against her chest now, not with sadness, but clarity. Rachel looked up. Nathan's voice continued. He was talking about reach, about impact, about being on the right side of global medicine. He didn't know, or worse, he didn't care. She felt her fingers tighten slightly around the edge of her notebook. Then she stood. It wasn't dramatic, no scraping chair, no gasps, just a quiet movement barely noticed. At first, but then, slowly, like ripples after a stone drop. Heads turned, one, then two, then all. Nathan paused mid-sentence, remote in hand, half-turned toward her. The slide behind him froze. Rachel's footsteps were steady. She didn't rush, didn't falter. The sound of her heels on the polished wood floor echoed softly, measured, deliberate. She walked the length of the table past the assistants who barely nodded, past the executives who squinted in recognition but not understanding, past Nathan, whose eyes narrowed slightly, though he said nothing. Rachel stopped at the head of the table, next to the glass water carafe. She placed her fingertips on the rim lightly, just enough to feel its coolness. She took a breath. Her chest rose once, fell slowly. The air in the room seemed thinner now. No one spoke. No one moved. In that moment, she didn't think about titles, or risk, or consequences. She thought only of the years she had packed herself into corners, of the folder on the shelf at home, of Willa's drawing, of Eric's voice saying, "No marble floors, just open doors," and of how quiet she had been. Too quiet. All her life. She had followed rules that had never seen her, had played a part written for someone who wasn't allowed to speak. And now, the room she had always served, always supported, was looking at her like she didn't belong. But, for the first time, she did not shrink. She belonged exactly where she stood. Not because they gave her permission, but because silence was no longer an option. Her hand remained on the glass. Steady. The decision wasn't made in that moment. It had been made long before, slowly, day after day, in coffee-scented mornings and quiet walkaways. It had grown in the spaces where her name should have been, in the click of keys typed too quickly, in the folders left unread. It had grown in the silence. And now, that silence had become too loud to ignore. Rachel's lips parted slightly not to speak, not yet, but to breathe in a new kind of air, one that tasted like something close to self-worth. The stillness of the room was not hostile. It was waiting. She could feel the eyes, the confusion, the unspoken judgments gathering around her. She didn't flinch. Just one move, she thought. Just one. She didn't need to be loud. She only needed to be certain. And she was. It wasn't loud. It didn't break anything. But the sound of water hitting paper silenced a room full of power. Rachel's fingers curled around the cool neck of the glass water carafe. Her other hand remained steady by her side, heart thudding like a soft drum behind her ribs. No one in the room moved. The stillness was not suspense. It was something closer to disbelief, like watching a leaf fall onto still water and realizing it would ripple all the way to the edges. She tilted the carafe, just slightly. Clear water slipped from its mouth in a thin, controlled stream, calm, uninterrupted. It landed directly on the stack of papers at the head of the table, the printed proposal, the graphs, the export projections, the numbers she had read and reread in silence. The ink bled almost immediately slow, blooming stains like bruises across the page. The sound it made was soft, gentle, a patter more felt than heard. But it was enough. Enough to pull every eye toward her. Enough to stop Nathan mid-thought. His mouth parted as if still holding a word that no longer belonged. Enough to drain the room of everything except breath and wondering. She placed the carafe down, delicately, then she looked up. There was no tremble in her hands now, no hesitation in her spine. Her voice, when it came, was not loud, but it filled the room. I flagged this 3 days ago. No one read it. She didn't turn to Nathan. Not yet. I printed it, highlighted it, placed it here. She motioned to the soaked papers now, wilting under the quiet weight of water. Again, no one noticed. There was a pause. Not the kind that waited for response, but the kind that let silence breathe between truths. I've been here for 3 years, on time, prepared, exact, and invisible. Now. Her eyes met his. Nathan didn't speak. His gaze was fixed, not harsh, not commanding, but unsettled, as if seeing something in her he hadn't realized was there. I'm not angry, she continued, and she wasn't. Not in the way they might expect, not in a way that would crack or shake. I'm simply done pretending that silence equals respect. Her words hung there clear, undeniable, no drama. No apology, just water, just truth. The pages were soaked now. The ink had surrendered. Colors bled into each other like years of her labor, her precision, melting into a puddle no one could ignore. And yet, there was no mess, no chaos, only transformation. Nathan opened his mouth, and for the first time, he said her name, Rachel. She didn't wait for the rest, not out of defiance, but because nothing more needed to be said. She turned from the table, calm as the morning tide, and walked the length of the room past the startled eyes, the shuffling shoulders, the unspoken questions. She reached her seat, picked up her bag, slung it over her shoulder, and then she sat back down. She didn't leave the room. She didn't storm out or slam doors or demand change. She remained, but this time, not as a shadow, not as background. She was exactly where she chose to be, and everyone knew it. The silence after was different, no longer cold or dismissive. It had texture now, like cloth once pulled too tightly. Finally released. Some looked away. A few lowered their eyes. One of the board members, a woman near the far end, exhaled slowly like something had just shifted in her chest too. Rachel placed her hands in her lap, folded, steady. The water spread in slow arcs toward the edge of the table, seeping into corners and margins, dissolving assumptions line by line. No one tried to clean it, no one dared. Outside the glass walls, the morning sun reflected against the snow-covered peaks. The world kept turning, the machines kept beeping, the hospital kept healing, and Rachel Whitman, for the first time in a long while, was not waiting for permission to exist. She had taken the smallest action, and it had moved everything. By noon, she wasn't the secretary anymore. She was a headline. It started with whispers, not outright, not accusatory, just curious. A glance held too long, a half smile that didn't reach the eyes. The kind of silence that said more than words ever could. By lunchtime, the halls of Grand Summit Health buzzed with a kind of restrained energy, the kind reserved for gossip that everyone pretended not to know but couldn't stop spreading. It moved fast. From the second-floor nurses' station to the admin cluster on 5, then on to the break room bulletin board in the form of a poorly photoshopped meme, a cartoon version of Rachel pouring water onto a stack of papers with the caption, "From water cooler to boardroom queen." Someone else added a tagline, "Collier's coffee girl makes a splash." She saw it on her way to refill her tea. Someone had tried to peel it off, but the outline remained, like a shadow burnt into the paper. By mid-afternoon, it reached the hospital's internal forum anonymous, poorly moderated, and always hungry for drama. A thread titled, "When Admins Attack Hero or Hysterical Gain Traction." The comments ranged from crude to clever, most laced with undertones she couldn't ignore. One accused her of having a vendetta. Another praised her for finally putting Collier in his place as if it had been performance art. But it was the blog that really changed everything. A local healthcare opinion site, known more for clickbait than credibility, published a short piece, did a glass of water. Earn her a promotion with a still image from a security camera clip, grainy, distant, but unmistakably her, standing, holding the carafe. The article speculated on her motives, suggested a hidden history with Dr. Collier, and questioned if the act had been planned for attention. The worst part, it wasn't even cruel. It was condescending, like she was a child who had stumbled into the adult table and knocked over the drinks. Rachel stared at her screen, the glow of it too bright in the dim of her office. The comments kept pouring in. Opinions formed by people who didn't know her name a day ago. People who thought they could pin her bravery onto a headline, turn her body into a metaphor, her action into an entertainment event. She hadn't expected applause, but she hadn't expected this either. Worse than the noise was Nathan's silence. No email, no comment, no follow-up. She walked past his office that morning, their eyes meeting for a moment through the glass. He looked the same, as if none of it had reached him, or worse, as if he had decided not to let it in. He hadn't opened the door. He hadn't said her name again. The absence of acknowledgement stung more than the rumors. It made her wonder, had she read him wrong? Had that look, that pause, meant nothing? Or had it meant everything? And now he regretted it. Either way, She was alone again. Only this time, not invisible. Now. She was visible in the way people stare at a traffic accident, visible in the way scandal burns through memory. She had asked to be seen, but not like this. By late afternoon, a mass email went out from HR, reminding employees to maintain professionalism and refrain from speculation regarding internal events. It didn't name her, but everyone knew. She scrolled past it, and then it came. An anonymous email, no signature, no subject line sent to every hospital employee. It was short, 3 sentences, 1 accusation, a question, veiled in certainty. How does a secretary leap into the boardroom? Must be more than coffee in that cup. Rachel stared at it, her breath stuck somewhere between disbelief and disgust. The cruelty was not in the words, but in how quickly they spread, how easily they were believed. How the very people who hadn't spoken to her in months now had something to say about her body, her motives, her worth. She closed the laptop slowly. Her hands were shaking, not with fear, not even with anger, but with something more dangerous, doubt. Had she been foolish, overstepped, misread the moment? What if this really was how they saw her? What if, after all this time, she was just the admin girl who snapped? Her chest tightened, a slow squeeze like hands curling around her ribs. The air in the office felt thicker, too warm, too loud with silence. She stood, walked down the corridor away from the noise, away from the flickering screens and pointed glances until she found the old side hallway that led to the staff restroom no one used anymore. The light above the door flickered softly. The linoleum was yellowed with age, but it was quiet. She stepped inside, locked the door behind her. The mirror greeted her with its usual indifference. Rachel stared. The woman staring back wore the same blouse, the same flats, the same hospital-issued badge clipped to her sweater. But her eyes looked further away, as if watching herself from the end of a long hallway. She placed both hands on the sink. The porcelain was cold, solid, real. She blinked slowly. Somewhere along the way, her name had turned into an idea twisted and repackaged until she barely recognized it. She had wanted to be heard, not for ego, not for praise, just to remind the world she existed beyond the clipboard, beyond the inbox, that she had a voice, a thought, a spine. But now, she felt hollowed out, used up by the very act of speaking. She turned on the faucet. Water poured out, steady, clean. She let it run over her hands, then cupped it gently, splashing her face, not to wash anything away, just to feel something. As the water dripped down her cheekbones, she looked again into the mirror. Her reflection didn't change, but somewhere behind the ache, behind the doubt and the betrayal, there was a flicker. Not fire. Not yet. But something stubborn. Something that had survived worse than words. When he finally said her name, it wasn't sharp, it wasn't commanding, it was almost apologetic. 3 days had passed since the email, since the blog, since the meme. 3 days of silence from the man whose desk had once held the folder she flagged, the same man who had watched her pour water on his mistake and hadn't said a word since. Until now. The message had been simple. Just a note from his assistant, relayed with clinical efficiency. Dr. Collier would like to meet with you. 4:00 p.m. today. Not a command, not an implication, just a line, just a time. Rachel had considered ignoring it, but part of her, perhaps the part that had always longed for something more than silence, put her bag over her shoulder, walked the quiet corridor, and knocked once on his door. The office was the same as always. Cool, uncluttered, air smelling faintly of paper and faint sterilizer. The blinds were half drawn, casting pale stripes across the dark wood of the bookshelf behind him. But something in the air had shifted. Nathan stood, not behind the desk, but beside it, as if the desk no longer fit between them. His posture was careful, not stiff, hands resting in front of him, fingers intertwined in a way that felt unguarded. He didn't gesture for her to sit. He didn't offer small talk. He just began. "When I was 10, he said, voice low but even, my mother was a nurse at a mid-sized hospital in Vermont. The kind of place where everybody knew everyone's name, even the patients." He paused. "She loved it. She was good at it. She worked long shifts, took extra training, mentored interns, never late, never careless." He looked down for a moment, as if retrieving the next part from a drawer too long closed. "But she crossed someone once. A surgeon, respected, high-ranking. She reported a patient misdiagnosis formally. Thought it was the right thing to do. It was..." Another pause. "But the rumors started fast. That she was angry, that she was bitter, that she had a personal vendetta." Rachel stood still, her hands gently folded in front of her, saying nothing. Nathan's voice softened further. "One day, I came to the hospital after school. She'd forgotten to sign a permission form. I wandered the halls looking for her. Found her in the staff restroom, his mouth pressed into a line. She was sitting on the floor, sobbing. First time I'd ever seen her cry. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was reverent. She left the job a week later. He said, they never fired her, just made it unbearable enough." Rachel's gaze didn't shift. She stayed grounded in that stillness. Nathan inhaled through his nose. Slow. Controlled. "I think that day rewired something in me," he said. "I stopped seeing tears as weakness. But I started seeing visibility as danger, especially for women who knew too much." The words hovered, fragile. Then he looked up, directly at her. "I didn't read your report. I didn't protect you. And I didn't say your name when I should have. This time..." The pause held more than memory. It held regret. She could see it now, just the faintest hairline fracture in the armor. Not enough to collapse him, just enough to make him real. Nathan stepped slightly closer to the window, letting a beam of late afternoon light touch his shoulder. "It's not about the water," he said. "It never was. It's about what we let happen in the silence." Rachel felt the words settle somewhere between her throat and her spine. She had imagined this moment before, had played it in her head, rewritten it, given it 100 endings, but not this one. She hadn't expected empathy, or vulnerability, or the quiet admission that sometimes the powerful are shaped by past wounds too. And yet, as she stood there, listening to a man who had never before offered more than clipped nods and cold dismissals, something within her shifted. Not forgiveness, but understanding. A space cleared. She looked at him, really looked, and saw not just the surgeon, not just the decision-maker or the nameplate on the door. She saw a boy in a white hallway, watching his mother cry behind a locked door. The silence stretched. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, measured. "It's too late for sorry," she said. Then, a breath, a pause, but not too late to change something. Nathan nodded once, not in defense, not in agreement, just acknowledgement. And that was enough. It was typed, printed, signed, and folded twice. But it never left her hand. The envelope rested against her palm, as if it had weight more than the paper, more than the ink. It carried the silence of every overlooked day, every nod that wasn't returned, every version of herself she had swallowed to keep the peace. Rachel had written the letter the night before, with the same care she used to format hospital reports: clean margins, precise spacing, no unnecessary embellishment, not bitter, not emotional, just honest. 3 short paragraphs, thanking the hospital, acknowledging the opportunity, and resigning, effective immediately. It wasn't impulsive. It had been coming in slow waves, each whisper in the hallway, each smirk, each anonymous email. Even Nathan's apology, sincere though it was, didn't erase the years of being unseen. She had folded it twice, slid it into a plain envelope, wrote his name on the front in small, neat letters, Dr. Nathan Collier. She carried it with her like a talisman, not to burn bridges, just to prove to herself she could walk away. But when she entered his office that afternoon, nothing felt like it had the day before. The sunlight had shifted slightly, slanting warmer across the floor. The blinds were fully open. A tray with 2 mugs of tea sat on the small table to the left. Not coffee, not for performance, just tea, just there. Nathan wasn't behind the desk. He was sitting across from the empty chair. He didn't ask why she had come. He simply nodded, and she sat. No words at first. Just the soft hum of the heating vent and the faint sound of footsteps beyond the door. Then, gently, he reached for a folder on the table beside him and slid it toward her. A new folder, her name on the label. Inside a draft proposal for the international partnership. This time, the data was clean, the projections were sound, and in the top right corner of the opening page, her name was printed as Strategic Liaison, Draft Review Copy. She blinked once, then twice. Nathan leaned forward slightly. Still no words, but his gaze held weight, not heavy, not demanding, just steady. As if waiting. She opened the folder again, scanned the role description. It wasn't just administrative, it was strategic, decision-making, direct reports, cross-department coordination, a seat at the table, not behind it. She looked up, her fingers curled tighter around the envelope in her lap. He must have noticed, because after a breath, he finally spoke. Not many words, just enough. She asked with her eyes, he answered with his own, and then she asked the question out loud inside her own thoughts. And in the quiet weight of the room, why me not as doubt, but as challenge? And he responded not with assurance or flattery, but with something closer to truth. Because you told the truth when everyone else was afraid, and because I'm tired of being the only voice in the room. She felt the sentence land not softly, not harshly, but precisely, like something placed gently into a space that had been waiting for it. She looked back down at the folder, not just at the content, but at the implication. This wasn't about a promotion. It wasn't about climbing a ladder she had never wanted to be on. It was about being seen, finally. But recognition doesn't erase memory, and validation doesn't untie all the knots. She thought of Willa, of the old photograph on the fridge, of Eric's voice in old voicemails still saved on her phone, of the long hallway to this moment. She thought of the envelope in her hand, the version of herself who had written it, steady, certain. She could still be that woman. She could still walk. But something in her had shifted since the day she stood with the water carafe, since the room stilled around her and silence broke into truth. She had spoken once. She wasn't sure she was done. Rachel stood slowly. Nathan didn't stop her. She took the envelope, slipped it into her bag, not torn, not discarded, just returned to the place it came from. She didn't hand it to him. She didn't explain. She simply met his eyes again. A flicker of something passed between them. Not resolve, not surrender. Something quieter. Maybe grace. Maybe beginnings. Later that night, at home. Rachel opened the drawer beside her bed and placed the envelope carefully inside. Not hidden, just held. Not yet, she whispered to the quiet room. Outside, the wind moved softly through the trees, brushing against the windows like an old friend returning. Inside, Rachel sat on the edge of her bed, the weight in her chest no longer tight, no longer sharp, still present, but lighter. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid to find out. She wasn't chasing a title. She was reclaiming something far more precious, her voice. The nameplate on the table said, Senior Strategic Liaison. But it wasn't the metal letters that carried weight. It was the way her presence now carved space into the room. Not louder, not bolder, just undeniable. Rachel stepped into the conference room 15 minutes early that morning, not to prove anything, but because preparation had always been her quiet armor. The long walnut table stretched across the room, scattered with open laptops and half-drunk coffee. Windows behind her cast soft Colorado light across the polished floor. The walls bore the same sterile art they always had, framed abstracts in muted blues and grays. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. She took her seat without hesitation, no longer in the corner, no longer against the wall. Her notepad opened to a page she had already filled with handwritten notes, not for show, not to impress, but because that's who she had always been. People entered in small clusters, executives with clipped strides and practiced greetings. Some nodded at her, a few offered neutral smiles. One or two kept their gaze slightly averted, not hostile, but cautious. She noticed, and she didn't shrink. When the meeting began, she listened first the way she always had, but this time, not from the sidelines. She absorbed, she analyzed, and when the moment came, she raised her hand, not as permission, but as signal. She spoke with clarity, presenting a revised timeline for the international partnership rollout. Her voice was steady, even measured, not apologetic. She referenced data, named the stakeholders, noted projected constraints. No one interrupted, but she saw the flicker in someone's eyes, that moment of recalibration, as if they had prepared themselves for someone else, someone quieter, more tentative, more agreeable. They hadn't prepared for her. As the discussion shifted toward logistics and budget projections, a senior director dismissed a concern she raised not rudely, just enough to suggest she didn't quite grasp the scale. His words were polished, polite, but dismissive. A month ago, she might have nodded, shrunk, folded the thought back into herself, and swallowed the discomfort. Today, she didn't. Instead, she paused, gave space to the silence, then leaned forward slightly, voice calm but firmer now. No innovation happens when voices like mine are filtered through people like you. The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They landed, not like a strike, more like a recalibration, a reminder. The room stilled, not frozen, just attentive. A breath held between old assumptions and new awareness. Rachel let the silence stretch, not to dominate, but to let the truth settle. Across the table, the senior director's expression shifted. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The message had been received. The woman beside him from HR glanced at Rachel, then back at her notes. Her fingers slowed, as if giving the moment more room on the page. Further down the table, Nathan sat quietly, but not passively. His eyes were on her, steady, composed, but with something new in them. Not pride, not surprise, recognition, not of potential, but of presence. As the meeting moved forward, Rachel offered two more suggestions. One was met with thoughtful questions. The other was marked for follow-up. She responded with measured tone, no defensiveness, no edge. She didn't need to push. Her presence was already doing the work. By the end of the meeting, her notes were folded closed. The laptop beside her remained untouched. She hadn't needed it. The voice she brought into the room wasn't digitized, rehearsed, or borrowed. It was hers. And it had been ready for a long time. After the meeting adjourned, some lingered exchanging comments, gathering papers, glancing her way. She felt the eyes again, but they no longer unsettled her, because they weren't wondering who she was anymore. They were recalculating who they had been in her presence. As she stood to leave, her gaze moved once more toward the head of the table. Nathan hadn't spoken much that hour. He hadn't needed to. But now, as their eyes met across the polished wood, he allowed a small smile, not broad, not performative, just enough. It wasn't the smile of someone proud of what he had done. It was the smile of someone who had finally made room for someone else to do what needed to be done. Rachel didn't smile back, not out of coldness, but because the moment didn't ask for it. Instead, she nodded once and walked out, not faster, not slower, just steady. The hallways outside felt brighter, not in light, but in weight. She didn't feel taller. She felt truer. This wasn't the end of a transformation. It wasn't the climax of her story. It was simply the moment her voice found a home in her own throat and chose to stay. The envelope was thick. The number inside was high. but her heartbeat stayed steady. Rachel sat alone in her kitchen, a cup of herbal tea cooling beside her, the light outside folding softly over the windowsill. The hospital seal was pressed cleanly into the flap of the envelope, its crisp edges unmarred. Inside, the future waited printed in black and white. The title Vice President of International Partnerships, 6 figures, executive benefits, an open door to every room she used to be invisible in. Her name, written in bold, not as Rachel the admin girl, not calendar lady, just Rachel Whitman whole, seen, named. The offer was generous, thoughtful, earned. She unfolded the papers slowly, reading each line with care, her own notes, once scribbled on legal pads in the margins of forgotten meetings, now echoed in the official language of boardroom plans. Ideas she had spoken aloud now embedded in diagrams, proposals, timelines. Her mark was finely visible, and yet the emptiness inside her was unmistakable. Not disappointment, not fear, but a quiet stillness, like standing in a beautiful room that wasn't hers. She laid the paper down and looked up at the fridge. There, between Willa's crayon drawings and a grocery list held by a ladybug magnet, was a faded photograph. She had stopped noticing it long ago. But today, it caught her eye. It was the attic room, the one she and Eric had painted sky blue the summer after their wedding. In the photo, she was younger, hair tucked messily in a bun, kneeling beside a stack of donated books. Eric was in the background, grinning, holding up a dusty first aid kit like it was treasure. They had called it the upstairs clinic, a dream more than a plan, a place where anyone, especially the forgotten, could walk in and be met with warmth, with dignity. No insurance forms, no clock punching, just care. Rachel stared at the image for a long time, not with longing, but with remembering. The letter on the table felt heavier now, not because of the weight it offered, but because of the weight it might steal. Later that day, she stood outside Nathan's office again. She knocked once. He looked up when she entered, gestured for her to sit, but she remained standing. She placed the envelope on his desk. He didn't open it. She waited. So did he. When she finally spoke, her voice wasn't cold. It wasn't uncertain either. It was the voice of a woman who had walked through fire and emerged not untouched, but clear. "I didn't fight to be seen," she said, "just to climb higher." She watched the words land. They didn't bruise. They opened something. Nathan leaned back slowly in his chair. Not defensive, not offended, just still. He looked at the envelope, then back at her, and after a long, silent breath, asked only one thing. "Then what do you want?" She thought about that for a moment, not as a question to answer quickly, but as a compass finally asked to point. And then, without hesitating, she replied, "To begin again, but this time, on my terms, in the heart of Buena Vista, where pain once lived, something new was blooming." The building stood quietly on the corner of a street that had barely changed since she was last here. The old pharmacy sign had been taken down years ago, its rusted bolt still clinging to the bricks like memory. Now, a hand-painted wooden plaque hung in its place. Willa House. The letters weren't fancy, the paint slightly uneven, but the name felt exactly right. Rachel had driven past this corner 100 times in her 20s, always imagining what it could be: a clinic, a resource hub, a place where no one needed a perfect resume or insurance card to be treated with dignity. Now, it was hers. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lemon oil and fresh paint. The floor still creaked in the back hallway, and the front windows fogged slightly when the kettle boiled, just as they had when the building housed aspirin and cough syrup. But the shelves now held something different: pamphlets on wellness, books on nutrition, journals for grief, a basket of crocheted blankets by the door, each donated by someone who believed in what Rachel was building. The furniture was borrowed or thrifted: mismatched wooden chairs, a whiteboard on wheels with scuff marks in the corners, a tea station in the back with chipped mugs and a handwritten sign that read, "Take what you need, Leave what you can. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't polished, but it was warm. And that was enough. The first workshop had begun that morning. 7 women sat in a circle, some in jeans and hoodies, others in long skirts and worn cardigans. One woman had brought her knitting, another had brought silence. Rachel opened with a simple introduction. She didn't talk about her title or her past. She spoke instead about starting over, about spaces that once didn't exist for women, like them the widowed, the forgotten, the ones who spoke too softly or too soon. They listened, not with eagerness, but with a kind of tired hope, the kind that takes time to trust again. At the end of the hour, a woman with silver hair and soft eyes raised her hand. Her voice shook, but not from nerves. "Am I too late?" she asked. "To learn, to help, to still matter." Rachel met her gaze, held it, then smiled, not wide, not forced, just gently. Never. It was the only answer she had, and the only one that mattered. That afternoon, long after the last chair had been stacked and the kettle washed, Rachel stayed behind to tidy the room. She adjusted the curtains to let more light in, lit a candle on the front desk, vanilla and cedar, rearranged the bookshelf by color, not because it was practical, but because it brought her peace. She was wiping the counter when she heard the bell above the door. She turned, half expecting someone who had forgotten a scarf or gloves. Instead, Nathan stood there, no white coat, no suit, just jeans, a worn sweater, and eyes that looked like they had seen more than medicine ever teaches. He didn't say much at first, just took in the room, the chairs, the warmth, the faint scent of lemon and tea. His gaze landed on the sign behind her desk. He nodded once, softly. They didn't need to talk about the money, or the anonymous donation that had arrived 3 weeks ago, labeled only as seed gift. She had suspected, but never asked. Now, she knew. She walked to the back counter, poured hot water into 2 mugs, and placed one on the table nearest the window. Then she gestured gently. He took the seat without question. There was no formality in the moment, no speeches, just presence. She sat beside him. For a while, neither spoke. It was a silence that didn't need filling, the kind built not from absence, but from respect. He looked around again, then said simply, "You made space." She looked at the worn wood beneath her hand, the chipped ceramic of her cup, the quiet echo of earlier laughter in the room, and she answered, not to impress, not to deflect. "I made it because I never had one." The words didn't linger in the air. They sank in deep, like roots in soft earth. And just like that, Willa House was not just a name. It was a home, not for escape, but for becoming. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long golden lines across the sidewalk. A breeze stirred the leaves on the tree by the door, sending a few fluttering into the street. Inside, 2 mugs sat side by side on a worn oak table. One woman, no longer invisible. One man, no longer untouchable. And in between them, warmth, real, earned, quietly shared. Sometimes, the boldest thing you can do is not leave, but return and rebuild. The letter sat quietly on the desk, folded once. Cream-colored paper held down by a smooth river stone Rachel had picked up on a walk years ago. Her handwriting always neat, always intentional, spilled softly across the page. Ink slightly smudged in one corner, where her hand had rested too long, lost in thought. It wasn't a resignation, it wasn't a declaration, it was a letter to her daughter. Willa was 16 now, sharp-eyed, quick to challenge, slow to forgive anything that felt false. She had grown up watching her mother move through life with quiet discipline, packing lunches, returning library books, nodding instead of arguing. But lately, she had started watching her mother differently. There was a new weight to Rachel's steps, not heaviness, but grounding, like she finally knew what direction her feet were meant to go. The letter was short. She didn't name the hospital. She didn't list the insults. But she spoke of the days when people called her that admin lady or the one who handles his calendar. She spoke of the years she stayed quiet, not because she lacked opinions, but because she thought silence was safer. She wrote about the water, not as a moment of rebellion, but as the first time truth became action. She described how her hand trembled, just slightly, when she lifted the glass, how the splash had been so soft, how the silence after had said more than the splash ever could. When Willa read it that evening, she didn't say much at first, just sat on the couch beside her mother, turning the pages slowly. Then she looked up and asked, "Is this really about work?" Rachel smiled, not quickly, not to dismiss, but the kind of smile that reaches the eyes, that says, "You see it now, don't you? It's about life," she said, "and having the courage to live it fully." Later that week, Rachel sat beneath the awning at Willa House. The autumn light curled across the wooden steps, brushing against her shoes. A cup of tea rested on the bench beside her. Not full, just enough. She didn't teach today. Others were inside now, mentoring, guiding, listening. The house had become what she had always hoped, not a monument to her strength, but a container for the strength of others. She watched as a woman in her late 50s walked up the steps. The woman paused at the door, smoothing her skirt nervously, clutching a small notebook. Rachel knew that pause. She had done it herself once outside lecture halls, job interviews, even the break room at Grand Summit Health. That quiet moment of wondering if you belonged before anyone had said you didn't. The woman stepped inside. The door closed gently behind her. No fanfare, no applause, just another beginning. Rachel leaned back, let the sun warm her face. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers loosely intertwined. No one would ever call her invisible again. But that wasn't the point. What mattered more was this. She no longer doubted her own presence. She no longer whispered to herself to stay small. And the voice she had found, the one buried under grief, fear, and years of being overlooked, had never actually disappeared. It had been waiting for her to stop apologizing, to stop shrinking, to stop needing permission. It had waited patiently in the silence. And when she finally let it rise, it didn't shout. It spoke, clearly, softly, fully, and now it welcomed others in. That evening, as the sky bruised into soft purples and golds, Rachel stepped back inside. Laughter floated down the hallway. A kettle whistled in the back. The scent of chamomile and lemon balm hung in the air like memory. On the community board, near the door, someone had pinned a hand-drawn sign, "You belong here." Rachel smiled, not because it was perfect, but because it was true. She paused at the desk, ran her fingers along the edge. The river stone was still there, anchoring the letter Willa had placed in a frame behind the counter. Her daughter's reply had been just 5 words. "You taught me to begin." She turned off the front light, locked the door, and walked home under the soft hush of evening. Not a new woman, but a woman fully returned to herself. Sometimes the most powerful voice is the one we've silenced the longest. Rachel's story reminds us that courage doesn't always look loud. Sometimes it's quiet, tired, hesitant, but it still shows up early in the morning, staying late at night, doing what's right even when no one notices. For years, she was overlooked, called by the wrong name, treated as background noise, but the moment she chose to speak not with anger, but with clarity, everything began to shift. This story teaches us that it's never too late to reclaim your voice. Not for attention, but for truth. Whether you're 36 or 66, your story still matters. Your dignity is not tied to your title. Your worth is not measured by who applauds you. You may have buried parts of yourself to survive, but those parts are still there waiting. And sometimes, all it takes is one quiet, deliberate act to begin again. So, if you've ever felt invisible, unheard, or dismissed, remember Rachel. And remember, you are not too late. You are not too small. You are not done. Thank you for staying with us through Rachel's journey. If this story touched your heart, reminded you of your own strength, or simply made you feel seen, we invite you to help it reach others. Like this video, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe to Shining Stories for more soulful tales that speak to the quiet corners of the heart. Every story shared, is a light passed on, and we're grateful you're here.